In this video, we are going to complete this exercise. This exercise is about creating execution context diagram and finding the output in each line of code that we have here. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy and paste the code here. So we can create the execution context diagram for this. We know that whenever you're executing any piece of code, it creates a global execution context. So we'll start from here and we'll go ahead and create a global execution context. So this is our global execution context. And the execution context will go through a declaration phase in the start. That is why we have written D here. The first thing you can see here is it will find a function declaration called getCounter. So let's go ahead and add a function declaration here. The name of that is getCounter. Moving on, we'll just skip all the other lines inside the function and we'll move on to this line directly. And here we have a variable declaration called counter. So we'll go ahead and create a box and we'll change the name to counter. So what will be the value of counter in start? Nothing, because that is what let does. Let doesn't initialize the box, it just creates the box. Moving on to next line, this is not declaration. Even this one is not declaration. No declaration, and all these lines are function execution. So we'll skip all these lines and we'll move on to top and we'll change the context to be in execution mode right now. So right now we are in execution mode. In execution mode, we only look for function execution and variable and a value assignment to a variable. So this is a function declaration. So we'll move on to this line. And here what we see is we are assigning a value that is getting returned from getCounter into the variable counter, right? So it will create a function execution context because every time you're calling a function, it creates a function execution context. And this is going to be the function execution context of getCounter, right? Now, what we will do, we'll go inside the function. And similar to how global execution context went through declaration and execution phase, even this function execution context will go through declaration and execution phase. Right now we are in declaration phase and we have a variable called private counter. So I'll go ahead, add a new variable and we'll change the name to private counter. Moving on to next, here we see a function named change by. So we'll go ahead, add another function here. The name of the function is change by. And at last what we are doing is we are returning this. So this is not a declaration. So first we'll move this to execution phase and we'll start from line number 1 again here. And what we are doing, we are assigning a value of 0 to private counter. Moving on to next is function declaration. So we'll skip this and from here we are returning an object. So we'll return an object like this and that object is going to have a function named increment, of decrement and value. So that is what is going to return from this function. So it will be increment, decrement and value. All these three things are functions. So we are just going to keep it here. It will get returned. So what we will do now, it will be assigned to the variable named counter. Why? Because here, if you take a look at it, we are assigning a value, whatever is getting returned from getCounter, to the counter variable. So right now, inside our counter, we have an object and that object contains three functions, that is increment, decrement and value. So here, now if you look at counter, you will see that it contains an object with increment, decrement and value functions. Important thing to notice here is, will counter contain something extra or not? And that is what is known as closure. And closure only happens whenever you're returning any kind of function from another function. So getCounter is a function and we are returning three different functions from here. So that case is going to match here. So whenever you're matching that, it is going to put all the value into the environment, that is private counter, and change by into a closure, and that closure will be present here. So this is the closure that will contain two values, that is private counter and change by. So because of closure, so the variable counter is also going to have extra values like private counter and change by function. So right now, when we take a look at the state that we are in, we have a function named getCounter and we have a variable named counter that contains an object with increment, decrement, and value functions. And it also contains extra closer. That closer has a value of private counter and change value. So now we'll move on to next line. So here the next line is calling the function counter.value. And we know that whenever you call a function execution context gets created. And this is the function execution context of value. So whenever you call this function value, what is going to happen? So you're saying return private counter. So the first thing that is going to happen is I have to return private counter. So I will look for the value of it. So whenever you're looking for the value, the first place you go to is the place of memory. Will you find it here? No, you will not. But there is an important thing here is this function also has a closer, and that closer has value of private counter and change y. What was the value of private counter? So the value of private counter there was 0. So I just write down here so we can just understand the value of private counter. So right now it is 0. So it will go into the memory, it will look for it, it will not find it. So where will it go? It will bubble out, but before that it will look into the closer. So this is the closer, and we know inside closer we have a value named private counter. So we have two values, but I'm just putting one because we just need one here. And what is the value of private counter? It is 0. So private counter will get the value and it will be returned from here. And what is the value that is getting returned from here? That is 0. So here the output is going to be 0. And after this output, the execution context will be deleted and we'll move on to next line. The next line says counter.increment. We'll again go ahead, create a function execution context. This is the execution context of increment. And what increment is doing is calling change by function with a value of 1. So change y is a function that accepts a value and it just adds that to private counter. So now, right now the value of private counter is 0. Here we are saying change by 1. So we are sending 1 as parameter. So it will be like private counter is going to be private counter plus 1. So now the value of private counter will change to 1. And here from increment, we are not returning anything. Are we returning anything? No. And when you don't return anything from the function, it returns undefined. So here, counter.increment, it is going to return undefined. And this execution context will be deleted and we'll move on to next line. And here we are again going to call this function increment, that is going to call change y with a value of 1, and we are going to increment the value of private counter from 1 to 2. And as soon as that happens, we know that increment function is not returning anything, so it is going to be undefined again. We'll move on to next line. The next line says call the function counter.value. So we'll again go ahead, create a function execution context, and this is the execution context of value. And whenever you call the function value, what we are doing, we are returning the value of private counter. So here we'll again do the similar thing. We are looking for the value of private counter. We'll go into our memory, will not find it. Then we will move on to our closer, and inside closer we have this, that is the private counter, and the value of that is 2. And that is the value that will get returned from here. And here the output is going to be 2. Moving on, we have another function that is decrement. So we'll delete this part and we'll create a function execution context again, and this is the execution context of decrement. And as soon as you call decrement, what it is going to do, it is going to call this function change by with a value of -1. So what it will do is private counter is going to be private counter -1. So now the value will be 1 and this execution context will be deleted. We'll move on to next one, and here we'll change the execution context to value. And we have to return private counter. What is the value of private counter? It is 1. So here the output is going to be 1. So in this way, the output that we assumed or we got was the first one is 0, second is undefined, 2. Here again, it is going to be undefined because the function decrement is also not returning anything. And last, we'll see the value 1. So after understanding the output, let's go ahead and open console to see what is the actual output. We'll paste the code here, and we're not going to execute it at the same time. We are going to execute it one after another. So as soon as we press enter, the value should be 0. Then we have to go for the next one. So we'll call increment, it returns undefined, and that is what we got. Then we'll go on to next one. We'll press enter, it is also returning undefined, and that was our output. Now we need to call counter.value, and we are getting the value 2. We'll go for decrement, press enter, we got undefined. We'll go for counter.value, and we got 1. So in this way, the output that we got here is the same output we are getting in our console. What does it mean? It means that the way we are thinking about how JavaScript engine is going to execute the code is exactly how JavaScript engine is executing the code. So we are done with this. Moving on to next is we have make counter, and we have to create execution context for this one. So let us copy this and paste it here. And here we'll again do the similar thing. We'll start from line number 1. But this time I'm not going to create multiple diagrams. We are just going to walk through the code and see what is happening at a specific given point of time. So to start with, we are in declaration phase, and first thing we see is a function declaration called make counter. So we'll go ahead, create a function declaration here, and we'll change the name to make counter. We'll skip all the other lines inside definition and we'll directly go to this line. So here we are saying we have two variables, counter1 and counter2. So I'll go ahead, create these two variables here. The first one is counter1 and the second one is counter2. What value they contain? Because we are in declaration phase, it doesn't contain any value. Next, all of these things are function execution. So we'll skip all these lines and directly go on top. And right now we are in execution phase. In execution phase, we don't look at declaration, we'll directly go to this line. And here we are calling this function make counter. And we know that it will create function execution context, but we are not going to do that. We'll just see what is happening here. So this function is having a variable called private counter, and it has a function called change by. And it is returning an object that contains three functions: increment, decrement, and value. And as we have seen it in our previous example, this function, when you call, is going to return an object, and that object is going to have three functions: increment, decrement, and value. Important thing to notice here is it is also going to have a closure, and that is why we are going to create a circle next to it. And that circle is going to have the value that was created inside the environment. The first one is private counter, and second one is change by. And private counter is going to have a value of 0. So right now we'll just write 0 here. So whenever you call the function make counter for the first time, it is going to return this thing, and that will be stored inside counter1. When you call it for the second time here, it is going to do the same thing, but this time it is not going to store inside counter1. Instead, it is just going to return in a next variable, that is counter2. But both will have same value, that is an object with three functions: increment, decrement, and value, and a closure that will contain private counter and change by function. So now let's move on to next line. And here we are saying counter1.value. So where is counter1? This is our counter1, and this is a function of value inside that. So it is returning private counter. So private counter, it will look for the value into memory. It will not find it. It will go into the closure. What is the value it will find? It will find the value 0. And that is what it will log. Moving on to next, we are calling a next function, counter1.increment. So counter1.increment will increment the value by 1, and now the value will become 1. Will it return anything? No, because here we are returning nothing, so it will return undefined. Moving on to next, you are doing the same thing again. So it will change the value from 1 to 2, and it will not return anything. That's why it will return, and it will return undefined. Moving on to next, here we are saying counter1.value. So counter1 is here, value is here. We are returning private counter. Inside counter1, what is the value of private counter? It is going to be 2. So the output is going to be 2. Moving on to next, So we are saying counter1 dot decrement, and that is going to change the value by 1. So it will be 1 from 2. So because we are decrementing the value by 1. Again, we are calling counter1 dot value. It will return private counter. The value of private counter is 1. So here the output is going to be 1. On the last line, we are saying counter2 dot value. We are not saying counter1 dot value. So we are saying counter2 dot value. What is the value of private counter inside counter2? It is still 0 the way it was earlier. So I'm just going to return 0, and the output here is going to be 0. And this is what I think the output is going to be according to the way we think how JavaScript is going to execute the code. So let's copy this code, execute it one line after another, and see if it is working in the right way or not. So we'll paste the code here. Rather than doing it all at once, let us cut this and execute one line after another. So first thing 0, we got the value. Moving on to next, here we are saying increment 2 times. We'll press enter, and then we'll go on to counter1 dot value, and that is 2. That is what we expected. Then we are saying decrement, and after that we are saying counter1 dot value, and we expect it to be 1, and that is exactly what we got. And at last we are saying counter2 dot value. We'll press enter, and that is going to be 0. So in that way, what happened is the output that we predicted here is the same exact output we got. And sometimes you would want to see and take a look at the closure, right? This is something that happens multiple times. You want to take a look at where is the closure. You want to take a look at that. So for that, what you can do is, like, we have created two variables, counter1 and counter2, right? And we know that both of these variables has a closure that we saw it here. This is counter1 and this is counter2. So if you want to take a look at it, what you can do, you can expand it. And when you expand it, you'll see decrement, increment, and value. When you go inside decrement, because this is the function and that function is going to contain the closure. So when you come down here, you will see two things, function location and scope. And this you will only be able to see it in Chrome browser. If you're seeing it in Firefox, you may see it in a different representation, but don't worry, it's the same thing. When you expand it here, what do you see inside closure? You see inside closure that you have private counter and change by function. The value of private counter is 1 right now, but when you do the same thing to counter2, you go into decrement and look at scope. Here you can see private counter is 0 and change by is a function. And it's not only that decrement is containing the closure. All these three methods or function will contain the closure. So increment also has closure and value will also have closure. So in this way, what we did is we executed this code and got the exact same output that we predicted here. So in this way, we completed this exercise.